In his peak years in the early 80s to the mid-90s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was one of the most sought-after and commercially viable action stars in Hollywood. But what I believe made him stand apart from contemporaries like Sylvester Stallone and Dolph Lundgren was his ability to shine across different genres. In this respect, one of my favorite examples is the 1990 sci-fi classic Total Recall, directed by Paul Verhoeven of Robocop and Starship Troopers fame, and starring Arnie in the lead role. While it eventually became one of the highest-grossing films of the actor's career, earning around $261 million, and is regarded as one of his most acclaimed performances, the journey to get there was far from smooth. This iconic film, based on a short story by Philip K. Dick, spent around 16 years in development hell, going through multiple cast changes, numerous canceled drafts, and failed production attempts before finally reaching the big screen. So the question begs to be asked, how did this project, with such a troubled production history and based on a weird and eerie story by a then obscure sci-fi author, ultimately become one of the most expensive, wildly imaginative, and violent sci-fi blockbusters of all time? In today's video, we will take a deep dive into this journey and also explore the legacy of Total Recall 36 years after its release. So, without further delay, let's get into it. But before we deep dive into the film, let us briefly talk about the Philip K. Dick short story the film was based on, titled We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. First published in April 1966 in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, the story focused on a miserable little salaried employee named Douglas Quayle, living in a futuristic version of Chicago, and has recurring dreams of visiting Mars. Looking for a way to make his dream of visiting Mars a reality, he visits Recall Incorporated to purchase artificial memories of the trip. However, during the procedure, it is revealed that he may have actually been a secret agent stationed on Mars, with his memories repressed for reasons unknown to him. The story had a much more definitive ending, revealing that Quayle's memories were real. He had actually stopped an alien invasion on Earth as a child by showing compassion toward a group of alien invaders. The film retained some of the story's core concepts, particularly the memory implementation procedure and the ambiguity surrounding reality. However, it expanded the story with grand action set pieces, a conventional blockbuster climax, and the Mars Rebellion. Like some of Dick's later adaptations, such as Minority Report, the original story was too short to sustain a full-length feature, so these additional elements helped expand his bleak vision of the future. As it turned out, these inclusions became one of the primary reasons the film was delayed multiple times since its initial acquisition by producer Ronald Shusett in 1974, who worked with screenwriter Dan O'Bannon for an early script titled Total Recall. It was O'Bannon who made some of the crucial additions to his draft, which would later make it to the final film. For instance, it was O'Bannon's idea to send Quayle to Mars, whereas the original story took place on Earth. Still, he was unable to come up with an ending that both Shusett and O'Bannon agreed upon. In this version, the handprint on the alien machine was revealed to be Quayle's, who is actually a clone of the original, and he gets back all of his memories when he places his hand over it. Here again, Shusett was unhappy with the ending, as it lacked the necessary dramatic punch. When no studios were interested in the script, mainly because of its high budget requirements, the duo moved on to collaborate on another classic sci-fi horror film of the era, Ridley Scott's 1979 classic Alien. Following Alien's success, Shusett secured a development deal at Walt Disney Studios, where he again tried to revive Total Recall with an initial budget of $20 million. Despite that, the film was stalled again because they couldn't agree on how to move with the third act. Ultimately, in 1982, the project was sold to DEG, Dino De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, after years of development and numerous drafts. In most of these rejections, the problem remained the same. Everyone was blown away by the central concept of the film, where human memories are up for sale, but no one could agree upon how the story would proceed in the third act, after Quayle goes to Mars. However, with DEG's involvement, the project finally seemed to be gaining momentum when producer Dino De Laurentiis hired the then-emerging genre filmmaker David Cronenberg to develop the film. Although Cronenberg's version was much darker and more faithful to the original tone, he still struggled to find a satisfying third act. In his script, Quayle was revealed to be Earth's dictator, Chairman Mandrell, and was advised by Mars Administrator Cohagen to confront the organization that had suppressed his memories following a failed assassination attempt. We later learned that Cohagen had chosen Quayle, an irreverent government worker, to impersonate Mandrell while secretly taking control of Earth. In the end, Quayle defeats Cohagen and assumes Mandrell's identity. Cronenberg's version placed greater emphasis on moral ambiguity and anti-capitalism, ideas that are frequently explored in Philip K. Dick's work. Predictably, the studio and Shusett were unhappy with this version because it had moved too far away from the Raiders of the Lost Ark Go to Mars approach of the original script. This disagreement is confirmed by Cronenberg himself in a 2003 Wired interview when he talked about his experience with the writing. Eventually, we got to a point where Ron Shusett said, "You know what you've done? You've done the Philip K. Dick version." I said, "Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing?" To make matters worse for the filmmaker, the studio wanted Richard Dreyfuss to play Quayle, whereas William Hurt was Cronenberg's original choice for the lead role. Clearly, the creative differences were becoming impossible to ignore. Cronenberg reportedly produced 12 drafts in a year before ultimately leaving the project and shifting his focus to what would eventually become The Fly. Although Cronenberg quit the film, some of his ideas made it into the final version, which makes you wonder what it would have been like if he ultimately made it. It could have been a disaster like David Lynch's Dune, produced by DEG in 1984 amid heavy studio intervention, but it also could have been visually and thematically spectacular, probably leaning more on horror and existential questions of memory and identity, and less on the action set pieces of the original Shusett script. This becomes more evident when we look at the Martian mutants and the design of the rebel leader Quado from the final film, which was taken from Cronenberg's version and fits straight into his body horror fascinations. Frankly, Quado reminded me of the grotesque creations seen in Cronenberg's films like The Fly and Scanners, where the physical and technological aspects intertwine with visceral transformations to create a psychologically disturbing appearance. After Cronenberg's departure, DEG considered Richard Rush and Bruce Beresford for the project. Rush, in particular, was enthusiastic about a revised ending by Shusett and O'Bannon, in which Quaid discovers an ancient alien device capable of restoring Mars's atmosphere. But De Laurentiis was skeptical about the ending and rejected it, leading Rush to depart again. De Laurentiis ultimately agreed to the climax when Bruce Beresford came on board and cited the ending as the strongest part of the script. Beresford's version of the script was less gritty, with a more sentimental and humanist feel. Once Patrick Swayze was cast in the lead role and Beresford took the director's chair, pre-production was underway on Total Recall, with sets being constructed in Australia. But production had to stop in 1988 after DEG went bankrupt following a series of box office failures. The bankruptcy led to the unfortunate firing of almost 80 crew members and the destruction of the sets. With such a massive setback and the huge pre-production cost of $8 million up until then, Total Recall seemed another of those cursed Hollywood projects which can never be made due to its sheer scope. However, with the bankruptcy, the rights were up for sale again, which led to Arnold Schwarzenegger's involvement with the project. Even though Arnie persuaded the independent film studio Carolco Pictures to acquire the rights to the film for $3 million in 1989, he had a long history with the project. Since its DEG days, Schwarzenegger was interested in getting the lead role of Quayle as he liked the blend of action and hard science fiction in the script. But De Laurentiis was less than keen on casting Arnie in the lead role since he considered him too masculine and assertive as opposed to the meek protagonist of the Philip K. Dick story. Yet, as luck would have it, it was after the Predator star's involvement that the film streamlined fast into production since his massive star power made the studio take a risk on this expensive project. Arnie's involvement was much beyond the usual star actor capacity. He was given a hefty amount of creative control for the film and was also involved in script rewritings under the supervision of the original writer, Ronald Shusett, set construction, major casting decisions, and even much of the film's marketing. In fact, it was Schwarzenegger who hired Paul Verhoeven as the director of the film, since he was a big fan of the Dutch filmmaker's previous sci-fi action satire, the 1987 film Robocop. With Verhoeven in the director's chair, the film became less of a big-budget sci-fi actioner and more of an ultra-violent satire. Verhoeven brought in Gary Goldman for the rewrites, and together they focused on refining the existing draft and making the sci-fi parts more realistic. In Goldman's revisions, the character of the mild-mannered government employee was changed into a muscular construction worker named Quaid. Like in his previous blockbuster Robocop, Verhoeven insisted on deliberately exaggerated performances from the lead cast members, including the star himself. He also brought in a heady cocktail of gruesome physical violence and dark comedy, seen in characters like the automated driver, the three-breasted lady, and Thumbelina. This over-the-top blend gave the film a distinct satirical and quirky edge, which set it apart from the other action blockbusters of the era. Like the original story, Verhoeven also put in elements of political satire in the film, especially in the entire Mars subplot, where we see different techniques implemented by Cohagen to colonize the Martians. The film also satirizes capitalism with garish interiors and the whole setup of Recall Incorporated. It presents to us a future set in 2084, which is bleak, dark, yet mildly hopeful. In fact, what made this version of Total Recall different from the other drafts was that the director wanted to double down on the possibility that everything after the recall procedure could be an implanted fantasy, but you can never be sure. This ambiguity was also confirmed by Verhoeven in a later interview. At the end, there would be two possibilities, and they would be both true. For me, they are both true. It's not either one or the other. It is a dream, and it is a reality. Verhoeven's focus on ambiguity also led Goldman to recast Hauser as an evil character, further confusing the audience about which one is the real Quaid. Verhoeven wanted the film to operate on two levels. You can watch it like any other high-octane Schwarzenegger action blockbuster, or you can also think of the movie as a joke about audiences buying tickets based on their memories of Arnie's previous action films. Whatever level you chose to watch it on, one thing is for certain: Verhoeven's insistence on blurring the lines between reality and fantasy made the film an exciting departure from other action tentpoles of the era. Another way Total Recall was different and remarkable from other big-budget studio blockbusters is the painstaking way they created Mars, relying heavily on practical effects, miniatures, and optical effects. However, the film used early forms of CGI in the X-ray scanner set pieces and was also one of the last major Hollywood spectacles of its era to rely so extensively on large-scale miniatures. The film also had more than 100 effects shots, including blue-screen compositing and motion control photography, and featured leading technicians of the era, including visual effects supervisor Eric Breivik, director of miniature photography Alex Funk, and special effects supervisor Thomas L. Fisher. The film also used a lot of practical effects, including animatronics, puppets, and prosthetic makeup for the robotic taxi driver, the fat lady disguise of Quaid, and the scenes of decompression in the famous sequences where eyeballs popped out horrifyingly on the surface of Mars. The film also featured around 35 expansive sets which were all connected through tunnels, including the alien reactor, which was one of the largest and most complex miniature effects sets ever constructed. Special makeup effects creator Rob Bottin supervised most of the character effects, including that of Quado, the mutants, and the decompressed heads. The Martian exteriors, spacecraft photography, and reactor sequences were primarily created by DreamQuest Images, which helped in the creation of a distinct visual aesthetic for the film. However, in many interviews, the effects crew had described some of the sequences, especially the X-ray scenes and the miniature works, to be particularly difficult to achieve technically, mainly because of the outrageous concepts and the lack of a visual reference point in the context of the genre. As Eric Breivik pointed out in an interview, at that time the tools didn't exist in the computer, so we had to work out real-world solutions. It's very easy to just default to a piece of software to solve a problem. I really enjoy working with other people who are still open to sweetening shots using photographic elements. After the release of the film, the efforts of the visual artists were acknowledged by various critics, with particular praise for the makeup, stunts, and CG rendering. The team of Funk, Breivik, Bottin, and Tim McGovern won the Special Achievement Award for Visual Effects at the 63rd Academy Awards in 1991, making it the only Philip K. Dick adaptation to date to win an Oscar. After an almost 20-week schedule in Mexico City, the film finally wrapped up its shooting under an estimated budget of between $48 and $80 million. However, the worries for the film were still not over, since the film originally received an X rating by the MPAA because of extreme graphic violence. The producers couldn't afford to release the film with the X rating, since it could restrict the viewership of what was one of the most expensive films of that time. So the studio decided on altering or reducing some of the sequences, in particular, to achieve the more commercial R rating. Among them, the most notable are Benny's death and Richter's severed arms, which were more graphic and prolonged in the original cut. Several shots of killing the doctors during Quaid's escape from the implant machine were also reduced significantly in the theatrical cut. In addition, other blood and impact shots like Helms stabbing in the bar and the bystander being used as a shield were trimmed accordingly to achieve the R rating. With all the corrections in place, the film was released on 1st June 1990 and became the 5th highest-grossing film of the year worldwide. Though the film enjoyed great commercial success, the critics were largely divided in their opinions during its theatrical release. Critics like Roger Ebert of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film 3.5 of 4 stars and praised Schwarzenegger's performance in particular for bringing out the innocence and vulnerability of Doug Quaid. But other reviewers like Rita Kempley of the Washington Post and Vincent Canby of the New York Times hated the excessive violence of the film. They pointed out the blatant misogyny on the display. Some reviewers found Schwarzenegger's performance lacking in the romantic and comedic sequences. Despite the mixed response to the film's narrative and violence, most reviewers praised its production design, visuals, and special effects. Along with the previously mentioned Oscar win, the film also received 2 other Academy Award nominations in the Best Sound and Best Sound Effects Editing categories. As the film became a glorious success, predictably enough, talks of developing a sequel also began during this period. Among the various promising concepts that emerged during the initial pitches, the most exciting one was developed by the writers of the original film, Goldman and Chaussette. The concept was derived from another one of Philip K. Dick's famous short stories, The Minority Report, which was repurposed for the sequel and featured Quaid as the head of an organization using mutant precognitives to predict and prevent crimes. The Total Recall elements were later discarded from the script, and Minority Report became an independent Steven Spielberg film starring Tom Cruise. Meanwhile, the producers of Total Recall, Carolco Pictures, faced financial difficulties in funding the project. Additionally, Schwarzenegger's busy schedule raised concerns about his involvement in the project. Soon after, Carolco Pictures went bankrupt, and Dimension Films acquired the rights to Total Recall. Under their banner, Matt Chirolnik developed another sequel, which served as a continuation of the first film. Dimension Films eventually came on board with the sequel, but it was ultimately scrapped due to the studio's financial problems and the star's hesitation regarding the script. Even though the ideas for a film sequel fell through, a single-season Canadian/German TV series titled Total Recall 2070 was broadcast in 1999. The show took the concept of the recall company and virtual vacations from the original film, blending them with the tropes of a paranoid psychological thriller and the noir aesthetic of another Philip K. Dick adaptation, Blade Runner. Like the 1982 Ridley Scott film, the show also takes place in a heavily crowded industrial setting governed by a group of powerful companies known as the Consortium. While the show lasted for only 22 episodes and had no relation to the original film, I really enjoyed its gloomy visual style and intricate world building, which reminded me of other 90s sci-fi noirs like Dark City. Much later, in the new millennium, Columbia Pictures acquired the rights to the film. Instead of making a sequel, they decided to remake it starring Colin Farrell, Kate Beckinsale, and Bryan Cranston. Directed by Len Wiseman of Underworld fame, the film largely follows the plot points of the original film and the short story, but with a significant change. This version of the story takes place entirely on Earth, and Mars is eliminated from the film. Instead, the film is set in a 21st century Earth that is mostly destroyed due to chemical warfare. There are only 2 places of habitable territory remaining, one being the United Federation of Britain, located in the British Isles in northwestern Europe, and the other being the Colony, which spans all of Australia. The protagonist, Douglas Quaid, works in the Colony and dreams of the UFB. although the reason behind the removal of Mars is not exactly clear. Len Wiseman said in an interview with Screen Rant that he followed the original story in which Quaid doesn't actually travel to Mars, but instead deals with the threat of an alien invasion on Earth. Again, Wiseman's claims about following the original story don't hold up, since the remake also borrows elements from the 1990 film, including characters such as Melina and Chancellor Cohagen. Mostly, this feels like a largely unnecessary remake which lacks the dark humor and satirical edge of the original. The 2012 version was moderately well received at the box office, but it couldn't replace the influential cultural status of the 1990 flick. The original film, which was responsible for a whole new genre of films questioning the legitimacy of memory and identity, like Memento, The Matrix, and The Truman Show, among others, was also remarkable for its sharp satire on totalitarian governments and an overall idiosyncratic tone that the remake didn't even address. In a way, the failure of the Colin Farrell starrer made us more appreciative of the original film, with all its suave action sequences, over-the-top acting, and remarkable visual effects. So, this was all from my side. What do you think of Total Recall? Let us know in the comments below. If you like what we do here in the channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one soon.